Okay, should be in good shape. Okay, so welcome to the Smart Salon on design research and ethics. I'm Richard Whitehall, a partner at Smart Design, and on behalf of myself and Leah Cabrera-Fisher, I would like to welcome you to the Smart Salon today. So just to introduce the topic a little bit, we've been working on a series of different salons over the last three months, focused on really important design-related issues. And really, this was based on a survey that we did at the beginning of the year, talking to different organizations about topics in design research that were top of mind and important for them. So the first couple of salons, we focused on engaging different organizations and how we can make design research more actionable within companies. On the second one, we looked at combining qualitative and quantitative research and how we kind of merge those two practices to create deeper insights. And today we're going to be talking about ethics in design research, which I think is a really great topic to end the year. We have a couple of salons upcoming next year where we'll be digging into a couple more topics as well. So in terms of the topic today, as design and design research has kind of grown in influence over the years, design is touching more and more people, and ethics has become an increasingly important topic for designers and researchers. There are certain sectors, I think, where this is particularly highlighted, and we've tried to pull a panel from some of the sectors that we think ethics is particularly important, namely the healthcare sector, technology, government, and different non-profit organizations. And in particular, we see a lot of companies striving to be sort of more inclusive in how they think about their customers or their citizens or participants in their work. So that's a topic we're going to explore today. And it also differs across different organizations. So we see some companies where design is very, very mature and has a big influence in the organization. Other places maybe where that role is still kind of growing and the role is more of an influencing role. So we'll be looking at those topics and really understanding how kind of ethical practices can be incorporated into design and design research work as we move forward. Just going to quickly introduce the panelists. So we're honored to have such a great group of panelists from kind of amazing organizations. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Margot, who's a UX creative director at Teva Pharmaceuticals, where she brings together diverse teams to use design thinking in order to reframe, learn, create, and deliver healthcare ecosystems that impact our day-to-day lives and their kind of practices at work. So welcome, Margot. Secondly, want to welcome Camilla, who co-leads the UK Policy Lab, which is a multidisciplinary team working across government to bring ethnography, systems thinking, futures, and design to policy development within the UK. And then Sarah, who is the co-founder and executive director at Greater Good Studio, which engages communities and stakeholders in co-creation of different programs and services. And then lastly, Oveta, who is principal creative director at Microsoft, where she works with a team of talented researchers, designers, and engineers, and their customers to visualize a clear path to digital transformation that starts in the now and builds towards the future. So welcome to all the panelists. So we have a few slides. So I think just to start things off, I'd just like to get each of the panelists to share an example that they provided ahead of time of how they've integrated ethics into their current design practices, and we'll just go across the page. So, Margot, maybe you could start out just by talking about your example.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. Really excited to share my experiences working with cancer patients within a pharmaceutical industry. This was a project that came out of human-centered ethnography research and co-creation work with patients. When I first joined Amgen, which was a company prior to joining Teva, in their fledgling customer experience group, we quickly found that the organization, as a pharmaceutical organization, was very interested in its mission to serve patients, but it was also very scared about how to do it appropriately and ethically. There's a lot of rules and regulations within the pharmaceutical industry that help guide the ethics overall. So this particular work was done with patients, and it helped us understand and listen to patients and then share their stories with the broader organization. So the patients that we worked with were asked to not only co-create with us as a way for us to develop better solutions for them beyond the molecule, but also share their stories so that we as an organization could start to build the muscle of what it meant to be patient-centric. So this is actually a snapshot of some videos that were shared on an internal website working with cancer patients, and then writing their stories and sharing those broadly within the organization. And really, this led to us being able to develop pathways for our team to show how we might interact with patients in an ethical way, and still learn and really explore the insights that they wanted to offer to us. So we went basically from a place where we did not interact with patients to a place where we could do it safely and ethically.
Great, thank you, Margot. Let's go to Camilla next.
Thank you so much, and hi to everyone who's on the call. So the image that you can see here on the slide shows someone called Julie, and just out of shot is her partner Sam. And they are a couple who met at university, both of them are 33, and they live in a place called Rotherham, which is in Yorkshire in the north of England. So we worked with them over the summer to understand their experiences of the pandemic, but we actually first met Julie and Sam and several other participants in this project about 18 months ago, when we were asked by a government team called the Disability Unit to help them deeply understand the lives of people with disabilities living in the UK. So that earlier work meant that when the pandemic happened, we had a group of people that we could return to see what had changed. And previously in the lab, a lot of our research on behalf of government policy teams was done using film ethnography. So we would send out a film, kind of a small film and research team to capture sort of hours of footage about different groups at home, at work, in kind of various different contexts. And it's quite an intensive way of doing research, but it's been the best proxy that we as a team have had over the 6 years that we've been around for bringing that kind of raw lived experience to policymakers. So the pandemic has changed how we're doing research, and we've been relying much more on our participants to gather material themselves. And in this second project involving Julie and Sam, we work with 9 participants living with different disabilities in the UK, checking in with them every week from June to early September by doing short video interviews and asking them to send us responses to kind of weekly tasks using WhatsApp and various other kind of communications channels. And the types of things that we were asking them was give us a snapshot of things that lift or lower your mood, show us how you're relaxing at the moment, how are you taking in information and watching the news, can you give us examples of caring for others and being cared for. And we also work with this group of people to visualize how they saw the future. And so what that meant was that over time we could build a kind of picture of not only how people with living with disabilities were experiencing the pandemic, but also how that was changing. And And I think, you know, you asked a question about ethics. This came up with the kind of understanding that's quite scant in context of the kind of relentless statistics that I think we've all become quite used to around the pandemic. And it gave us much better insights of kind of attitudes, beliefs, experiences. So just to give you a flavour of what some of those things were, our participants were telling us things about how, for example, their understanding of boundaries and limits had changed. They were limited in who they could physically be close to, but the kind of the sense of home had become a real boundary. We were working with a group of people experiencing a range of different physical and mental disabilities. And so for many of them, concepts such as lockdown and being confined to home were quite familiar, but as we scratched beneath the surface of that, we came to understand actually how much anxiety people were carrying during this period. And there were also big issues for things like identity, perceptions of self, you know, some of the labeling around people that were shielding or kind of additional labels to do with vulnerability were quite problematic and understandably kind of internalized by this group of people. So what that meant was that we now have this kind of bank of evidence that has been built over time, which is quite atypical in a policy context. And the disability unit, who was our commissioner in this project, will use that to inform their exit planning from the pandemic, but also a kind of national strategy that they're developing for disabled people. And I think what this work shows, which is quite indicative of our work with policymakers, is how to bring a new type of material to policy development that relates to things like values, perceptions, beliefs, which most of the time are just off the table.
Great, thank you, Camilla. Yeah, that's kind of interesting to hear the similarities across those two kind of examples. Sarah, let's go to you next.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. And Camilla and Margot, I love hearing your stories, and I'm so excited to talk more with you about this topic. I'm Sarah Canter. I run a small design studio in Chicago called Greater Good Studio, and we work exclusively in the social sector. So our clients are nonprofits, foundations, and government. This was a project that I think was a good example of ethics because, if anything, the constraints of this project pushed us to think about who is a designer and who is on the design team in a different way. So the caption here says local design team members share concepts at a community event. What brought us to that point was, and this was about a year into an 18-month engagement, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation had been working for years at the intersection of health and place. And they said, we know all about the problems of people's neighborhoods, specifically how your genetic code actually has less of an impact on your lifelong health than does your zip code. And so how do we make places healthier for kids? Because we can't move everybody to, a better neighborhood. And so they asked us to work in 6 communities across the US. I think with the goal being that if we worked in 6 really diverse communities, that anyone across the country could see themselves in our work. And so we worked in urban, rural, and tribal settings, all 4 time zones across the US, and a really wide range of demographics in terms of our community groups. But for our team at Greater Good, what it meant was that we weren't going to be able actually to be in 6 places at once. And so we had to come up with a better solution, and that better solution has actually become a really big part of our work since then, which is to build a local design team. And so rather than us being the ones to essentially go out, do research, build relationships, present ideas, gather feedback, we instead built the capacity of a group of cross-disciplinary individuals, multi-sector teams, to actually be the ones to go out and sort of do HCD, if you will, do human-centered design. And we provided workshops and coaching and some facilitation to help them do that. But ultimately, and this is one of the two, there were two community events throughout the duration of the work. This was at, I believe it was called our Ideas Workshop or Ideas Lab. And this was one of the design team members in San Francisco. We were working with a group that was mostly Filipino, with the Filipino American Development Foundation. And they had built a design team comprised of locals across a particular San Francisco neighborhood called Soma, or South of Mission. And they were looking at a lot of gentrification and displacement that was taking place in their neighborhood. And working with this group, it would have been, if anything, probably strange or even inappropriate for designers from Chicago to come in and say, we know the ideas, we know what you should do, but rather this design team were kind of the face of the project to the public. And I think based on this approach, which we've seen, we saw be very successful across the 6 communities, a lot of those projects that they sort of created and then piloted are actually coming to root. So they're actually being implemented. So that was a story that I wanted to share. Thank you.
Very cool. And then last of all, Obetta, could you go through your example?
Yeah, my example is pretty, it's not as expansive, I think, as the Sarah's and Dr. Camilla's and Margot, but I think it's a good example of some of the kind of codifying I've tried to do in the artificial intelligence systems, automated product design niche that I found myself into as a design researcher. So I was a lead design researcher at IDEO, and we were working in New York with a large organization that collects a lot of data around the world. And we were trying to really understand what we call an ethical principle that we came up with in design for AI, balancing the give-get loop. And that's basically looking at what you collectively take from an individual in data and trying to balance out the benefits to that individual in an ethical way, so that you're not kind of taking too much from them and not giving them anything in return, but also that you're making sure that whatever data you're collecting individually is something that is for their benefit, rather than just the companies or the organization that is trying to collect this data. And really that's based upon this idea that data is connected to our humanity and not that data is just some external factor or an output. It's really connected to who we are as people. And we see it as a personal belonging, not just kind of some output that individuals have. And so in this example is I think it shows two things practically, that we're going to have to start thinking about how we do research in general when it comes to AI and ethics, because a lot of our traditional research methods, especially things like interviewing or even card sorting or depend upon the participant to give us clarity. And I think sometimes when you're talking about artificial intelligence and things that a lot of people really don't understand how they work or how they would be affected by it, that it's not just enough for us to ask them these questions. And so we created this game called Data Monopoly, where we actually gave value to data points such as your credit card number, your social security number, your address, your medical records, and really put a slate of benefits on we had an actual game where they could put down the value of their data with the benefit that they could receive, and talk to us about why they would use their credit card in this or their medical records, or not use their medical record in this instance. And it really gave us a new way for them to put value on data, whereas before data was just kind of like this nebulous thing that they felt like the company already had, so they didn't have any choice. But also put ownership to the data and connect it to their benefit of what they think they want from the company for giving something up. And it was a wonderful research tool that we use that encompasses, I think, not new methods, but more non-traditional research methods like game playing, because it's really difficult to use traditional methods to talk about highly sensitive or ethical, or even things that you just can't put in words. And game sometimes releases that category of connection from people.
That's great. That's a really, really good kind of story to wrap up the first part, I think. I mean, I guess all of these to kind of some extent, we're trying to figure out, you know, how do we get people to sort of talk about some of these stories, and then how do we kind of express those in an ethical way? So before we get into the main discussion, I'm going to share a poll during the discussion, which is just to get a sense of what the audience thinks about the, you know, what are the largest barriers to ethical design practice. So I will put this up during the next section, and then we'll come back to it after that. I would just encourage everybody to put questions into the Q&A box. And when we get to the end of the next section, I'll pull some of the audience questions. So we'll make sure to kind of cover those and intersperse them as we go along. So having said that, I'm gonna close down the slides so you get to see everybody's faces a little bit more. And I'll hand it over to Leah to run the next set of questions.
So our first question is for Sarah. So we wanted to know, like, your perspective on what are the different aspects of ethics that design researchers should consider.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to potentially frame the conversation, although I also would really love to hear others' take on this one, because it is such a broad question. I think the first thing that we should sort of clarify is that ethics are not really the same as morals. I think those terms get interchanged a lot, but a set of ethics is really just a code of behavior. It's a set of rules or guidelines for how we should all act. And, you know, those could be good or bad compared to what maybe we would say today. For example, the mafia had a code of ethics, which maybe we wouldn't agree with their code of ethics, but it was, you know, legit. It was things like don't look at your friend's wife was on their code, right? But morals are different. And I think the first step is really to say, okay, so what do I believe in, and how do I want to potentially bring my morals into my ethics? How can I sort of codify my morals? When I think about ethics in design, which I agree is a practice that is somewhat dispersed right now, I think we all have maybe different guiding principles. But the way that I think about it is about, actually, I love, Oveta, your term, the give-get loop. I think about how are benefits and burdens distributed. And so the first layer of that is how are benefits and burdens distributed across society, right? Like, not evenly, I think, is something that we know to be true. And so to that point, we at Greater Good, at least, we think a lot about, you know, who are we working with? Are we working with clients who could work with any design firm? Or are we working with clients who maybe don't have access to traditional design firms? Are we working with clients who've ever had a consultant or a design partner before? And are we working with clients who are specifically working on issues that are of importance to us as individuals? So we stake our claim in the social sector. We want to work with organizations who are already making a dent in the systems of oppression that govern our society today. So we want to work with organizations who are focused on equity and justice, increasing access and opportunity. But, you know, That is not necessarily a choice that everyone has as a designer. However, you can also choose your choice of participants, for example. So who should we bring into this project? Who are the stakeholders? Who is getting benefited by this work? Who might be burdened by this work? At a sort of societal scale. So, that speaks to things like, do we have representation on our project from, different race or ethnicity backgrounds? Do we have different socioeconomic tiers represented in our research to make sure that we're really hearing from people who need to be heard from? Because I would suggest, just based on my background prior to Greater Good, when I did work in more of the corporate innovation space, that we all know about those pro-research participants who are being heard from over and over again. And I guess the other thing I'll say about benefits and burdens, and this is a lot more sort of narrowed into design research, is how are they distributed across your project? Sometimes we think about benefit as like, well, money, I'm getting paid, or someone is getting paid, or someone will make money as a result of our work, whether that's the client or their stakeholders or their shareholders. But there are lots of other benefits, and there are lots of burdens as well to consider in the design research process. So, who is gaining power through your project, or prestige? Who is getting a career advancement, or some degree of organizational value? Who is getting compensated financially, and at what rate are they getting compensated? Versus, when we think about burdens, we think a lot about who's doing the work, who's spending the time, and also how easy or comfortable is that for them. So, it might be really easy and comfortable for a client to come to a meeting because they're like, I'm a client, I come to meetings. That's what I do every day. This is not hard. Versus, when we invite, for example, research participants to a workshop, that is often a scenario in which there are multiple ways that person is made to feel uncomfortable, potentially even re-traumatizing them. For example, we see board meetings that use Robert's rules being really traumatic for folks that have been impacted by the criminal justice system. So there are all kinds of ways that, the structures of our workplace can actually cause harm that may not actually even be something we're conscious of until we really look at that from a societal perspective. So, long story short, there are benefits, there are burdens, they come in different forms. You got to think about them all, big picture and in our work.
Thank you, Sarah. So in thinking about this, Margot, you work in a highly regulated industry, right? So we were wondering, from your perspective, where do the design team's responsibilities begin and end? And what can we control, influence, and what is sometimes out of our control?
Yeah, so coming in and working in a highly regulated industry, it's a great opportunity to work within the rules that exist for good reason. Things that, we have to avoid inappropriate discussion of the products. We have to avoid seeming like we're selling or incentivizing people to use our products. And also we have to make sure that we have the ability to capture any adverse events or complaints from research participants that are potentially using our products that we're talking to. So, I think that being in a highly regulated industry lends itself to, really being creative about how you think about interacting with patients. And it really allows you to focus on what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve and balance that with the people that you're working with. So one example is we did a lot of work with cancer patients and really trying to understand their needs on a day-to-day basis. As we're developing new therapies, these are therapies that may not ever see the light of day. They may not have the clinical outcomes that we're looking for. And when we're talking to terminally ill cancer patients that maybe in the last month of their life, we cannot give them the impression that there's something coming that could save their life, right? So this is a really, maybe one of the most impactful ethical questions is, how do we ensure that we're setting up the discussion in such a way that we're not giving them false hope, that we're trying to learn from them because they're having this experience living with cancer, managing cancer, but we're not there to, say this is going to change your life, and this is for you. So it's a really delicate balance, and I think to Sarah's point, working with these patients, it's also, we have to make sure that they see a benefit to talking with us, right, and sharing their story with us. That's not just for us to have a feel-good moment, right? Or for us to, share a video internally, right? It's because we want them to hear their insights, and that will change the way that we're going to develop our medicines. And it's really important that they understand that the value that they bring. And it's not just here's some money and we want to take something from you. It has to be that mutual give and take.
Well, Vetan, from your perspective, so your industry is a little bit different. Perhaps there's not as much regulations. And I wonder, as you think about this, where do you see the responsibilities of the design team? And is there anything that's out of our control? How can we influence some of this product decision-making process? Yeah.
So I didn't hear a name, so I was wondering if you were talking to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I think mostly because of data and AI, tech used to be the Wild West, right? You could pretty much do anything in technology and nobody cared. And I think the problem came, well, at least people started recognizing that might not be a good thing when 2016 obviously was a watershed year for tech. There were a lot of nefarious things going on, backed and literally accelerated by algorithms and AI. And to be quite honest, designed that way. The algorithms work the way they were designed. So let's not get it twisted there. It wasn't just some Russian dude in a apartment in Czechoslovakia that ruined 2016 election. Those algorithms were designed to work the way that they do. They were biased. They were designed to accelerate bias and even inject bias. When I did a study on basically kind of when you have cognitive bias or affirmative bias or these other cognitive biases, automation bias, other things that happen in psychology, and you cross very aggressive algorithms with them, crazy things happen. People start believing that the earth is flat. And so a lot of people laugh when I say that, and I do presentations on ethics and design all the time, but they were designed this way. And so I feel like our responsibility is to not design stuff that harms people. And human-centered design has an ISO definition, just like engineering does. And the first part of that is we go and we talk to people. A lot of what Margot was saying, getting people's input and requirements. But the second part of that is we do no harm. Mentally, physically, and psychologically. And it says that in the definition. And so I tend to have this very strident idea about designers. And I don't know if designers and researchers are actually ready for what I think the responsibility they should take. I mean, we whine about engineering and product teams and taking away our sovereignty as designers, but are we ready to take the reins from them and lead in human-centered design, especially in the AI world? And so, Sarah, I'm going to pick on you and George. So I was reading this article that George wrote that was amazing about redoing design competitions, right? And he lists Reading like design principle, the 10 design principles of, you know, design is honest and design is minimal and all that.
Dieter Rams.
Yeah,
Dieter Rams. Yeah.
Dieter Rams. And I rewrote them to be more proactive, right? So like this idea that, you know, good design is a little design is possible. And my definition is good design purposely brings order to chaos. It's so the, like, I love Rhymes' list, but to me, it's not, it doesn't go far enough in our responsibility. Why? Because we are dealing with technologies that rapidly change our society at scale. And you can design a chair and yeah, it can get recalled, but the vast majority of our new designs, our products, we have a new shift in paradigm about the outcome of those. It used to be we worried about the functionality of our designs, whether a chair was sturdy enough or fit or whatever. And now we have to worry about their performance and decision making, which is a whole different paradigm. And because of that, I feel like designers have a whole different responsibility. And we have to be a lot more proactive. And I call it design with a verb, not a noun. Meaning we have to accept the responsibility of our outcomes of our designs in a way that in the past we didn't have to. And you know, like good design is honest, like that's one of the design principles, but I'm like, good design stops dishonesty, right? Like that's even going beyond that. We have the ability to be honest in our designs, and we're leading technology to say this is an unethical product. And in research, one of the things I like to do, people always talk about empathy, and I always say that people got empathy wrong. People say, oh, it's about you getting into other people's shoes. And I'm like, no, empathy is about digging within yourself and finding when you're as vulnerable in the situation that the people who are going to be using your products will be, and tapping into that so that you don't design that to hurt yourself or anybody else. And so when I'm in a meeting and some engineering guy says we need to put, you know, vision and glasses that nobody can see and we can walk around and they could, you know, I mean, this is, and I'm not making this stuff up, y'all. Then I say, yeah, let's do that. And I'll put that on you. And we'll start with you. And then we'll talk about what that feels like. Like that's my responsibility. Like that's my responsibility as a designer. And so Leah, you started me, but you know, I'm on the spectrum of designers have a responsibility to purposely and intuitively bring order to chaos. And we have to be ready to accept that responsibilities, which means we have to have processes, policies, and practical product making procedures that encompass that type of proactive, non-harming to humans for large scale AI supported products that don't take a lot of time to change whole societies. Again, like it didn't take a lot of time for social media to affect our elections. So I'm not trying to be an alarmist, but I am trying to say we have a different responsibility in the AI age.
Thank you. But you were getting a lot of love in the chat. I just wanted, sorry, go ahead, Margot.
I would say, you know, I don't think it applies just to AI. I think it also applies to the practice of medicine as well. I think it's it's a slightly different way to think about it, but we have a moral obligation to, you know, we have, you know, COVID vaccine is coming. A lot of people are thinking a lot of different things about it. And is it transparent, right, to everyone what the implications are? So I think of it, you know, I'm in pharmaceuticals. So when we think about pharmaceutical development, what is the designer's obligation in how we discuss and share the insights that we have? And then how do we design the solutions considering the implications.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're mixed
So
now, right, Margot? They're mixed. CRISPR, I mean, we literally can redesign DNA, right? We literally could do that today,
Yes.
like a computer code. So again, we are where we were in the 70s when they're like, should we do IVF or in vitro and then bioethics, right? Like in the 50s and the 60s. And the baby's gone, like it's gone. Like we're reproducing, cloning babies right now. So we're at that moment, guys. And so we have to really think about our responsibility that way, in the same way that they were thinking about it in the 50s and the 60s about medical advancements and ethics and bioethics.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Alveda. I wanted to also ask you, Camilla, because you're working in policy and the designers that are working with you are influencing policy making. There's a lot of curation that's happening with the stories that you share within your team. So I just wanted to ask, how do designers working in policy making environments factor ethics into design making process? How do you think about your team's responsibility in that context?
Yeah, thank you so much. There's just so many good ideas on this call. It's like late at night here and I'm trying to get my brain to follow. But yes, amazing thoughts from everybody. So, there's so many layers to this in our world. So I'm just remembering something that someone said to me quite some time ago, and it was a description of the policymaking process, which was something to the effect of, we come up with an idea and we lob it over the fence and we hope for the best. And, I don't want to do a disservice to some of the amazing policy making work that goes on, but there is this sense of these these meta decisions affecting millions of people's lives that have never been tested, have never been tried out, and off they go. And of course, we find out about all sorts of things that don't work. So when you sort of break that process down, it becomes quite extraordinary that we don't bring some of the actually often quite simple things that we do in design research about just asking people what their experiences of things are and using that to inform decision making. But this question of ethics in a policy making environment for designers in particular is really layered, because on the one hand, there is, by virtue of being inside that kind of institutional environment, one of the constraints that I certainly feel a lot myself is you are sitting in a place where you have the ability really to shape very large scale things, and that is an extraordinary responsibility. It's a massive privilege, and it's something that cannot be taken too lightly. At the same time, you're quite constrained in what you can say. So you are learning all sorts of things about how people experience government systems, policies, other things, and you can't talk about that publicly. Just as an aside, that's in part why I think it's really, really important that this kind of socially motivated design work that all of my fellow panelists are doing has a kind of ecosystem of people who are working, at different points inside big institutions, who are moving outside big institutions, because I think in a way as a community we kind of need to build our voice about what it is to do this kind of work, and you are constrained in your ability to do that when you sit on the inside. You're constrained in your ability to really see how kind of societal processes work regarding policymaking when you sit on the outside. So I think there needs to be some movement. But in response to your question about how we think about ethics in our work and what that means in terms of how we interact with policymakers. So there's a ton of sort of quite technical stuff to do with processes, safeguarding, and I think in a way, by virtue of us, I'm a civil servant. I sit inside a government department in the UK, and there's sort of a ton of things about the rigidness in a way of that environment. It means that we've had to make our practice more rigorous, and I think that's a really, really good thing for design research. And I've been in and around this space for a long time now, and I've definitely seen things over the years that just really make me wince, coming from well-intentioned designers moving into kind of really complex policy areas. So I think it is right and good that we are maturing in terms of our research practices, and just to give you some examples of what I mean there on the process side of things, stuff like how long we keep data for. We have to be really explicit about who is processing it, where it's stored, we are very clear with our research participants about whether the material that they're giving us from their lives is going to be for public use or for private use. We never pay people, we give people what we call incentives, and we acknowledge their work, but we don't offer kind of cash payments, in part because a lot of the communities that we work with might be in receipt of government services, and if we give people a payment for service, that can interact with things like the receipt of benefits. So we have to be really, really careful on all of the process and the safeguarding side of things. And I think our first responsibility is actually to our research participants rather than to our policy commissioners. And then there's sort of the more values-based stuff, which I think Sarah kind of blew apart for us really amazingly at the beginning of this discussion, which is, you know, why are we doing this work of bringing these really tender, revealing insights into the kind of analytical and rational world of policymakers? You know, why are we bringing the kind of raw matter of people's lives into, you know, it's very countercultural in the kind of world that I'm from. And you know, we have a position, people like me who are kind of working inside the system, we are coming from the vantage point that we think it makes policy decisions better if, you know, there is an understanding of lived experiences as part of them. And then I think there's this kind of, you know, then there's a bit of a question there around legitimacy, and I don't think as a community we have really bottomed some of this stuff out. So I think you guys have heard me say before that I think certainly in the public sector design world, which is where I work and which is now huge and global, I think there's been this desire to sort of get a foot in the door and just to be doing this kind of work. And actually as a community we haven't been that explicit about the sort of values, like, you know, the motivation to represent lived experience that sits behind it. And I think that we probably have some kind of collective maturing to do around what values we're representing, why we're doing it, and perhaps being a bit more open about some of the research practices that are underpinning that.
Thank you so much. So you guys have mentioned a couple of things from like how do we collect data, our responsibility, but just in closing this first section, I just was wondering, Sarah, for you, like you're working with a lot of nonprofit organizations and we're hearing this of like how we build empathy and how do we understand our users, right? But what happens when, or how do you balance the mission of your client organization and the needs of your research participants? And I think this is a challenge that happens across, like probably for all of us, but what happens when these two things don't align?
Yeah, I guess I first wanted to just briefly respond to Camilla, because what you were saying is so true. And I think we see it in the nonprofit space just as much as in the government space. There are so many designers now who are so interested in, you know, giving back through their work or having their work make a difference or, you know, change the world, etc. And I think that's great. That's certainly where I was when we started Greater Good 9 years ago. But the maturing is real, and you cannot rush it. You cannot say, okay, boom, now you know how to work with, you know, vulnerable groups and balance their needs with the needs of our client and think about the societal context in which these inequities are taking place, even if we're only working on literacy or healthcare or, you know, issue area A. So I just really appreciate that. And I'm curious to hear more about how we as a profession can actually provide some of those rudders to help people mature a little faster. When it comes to clients and participants, I mean, in some ways that is almost an existential question. It's almost like, why are we designers? Well, we're here to balance the needs of both. Like we are here to, I think good design, one of the ways that I think about good design is that it resolves the needs of multiple stakeholders. However, I would say that assumes a level playing field, and we know that the playing field is not level. So our clients come in with essentially all the power. They have decision-making power, they have some level of structural power, whether it's a nonprofit that operates a program in a particular community or a foundation who gives money to lots of nonprofits. They are organized, they have power. Research participants, almost by nature in many cases, don't have power. It's almost part of why we need to hear from them, because nobody else is. And so when our clients hire us, I think about that as actually a really brave act, because when a client is hiring us, they are deciding to share their power with users, with participants. They're actively saying, I'm going to give up my 100% control over decision-making, and I'm going to share it with some other people who I don't normally hear from, right? So at a base level, they are open to that. However, some clients are like, I'm totally open to that. And then whatever the feedback is, they're like, wow, who knew? Great, let's make changes. And others are like, wait a second, that doesn't align with what I was expecting, right? And so we try to prepare our clients going into research. Like, we might hear things that surprise us. We might hear things that challenge our assumptions. We've had clients get, really upset when they hear, for example, that perhaps some community members don't like them, or don't feel that their services are fair. And a really simple example that just happened yesterday. So I'll just share it because it's top of mind. We had done some research. This is a healthcare project. We're actually looking at like a patient-doctor sort of communications toolkit, and one of the questions was around the format and the form, and basically users, both providers like actually oncologists in this case, and then also patients and caregivers, they all wanted a folder. So there, we had a folder, we had a binder, we had, flashy note cards, we had like an app, we had, all these different form options, right? And people wanted a folder. And they wanted a folder because it was practical, because the doctor's office could make printouts and put them in the folder, because other stuff was going to need to fit inside that folder, because it was light and portable and didn't feel like work the way that a binder does. There were all these reasons, right? They're all user driven. And the client was like, oh, folder, eh? They're like, it's just, I don't know. I in my experience, I think people want something maybe a little more sexy, like a little more new or flashy or exciting. And we were like, yeah, that is legit. We hear you. And we're pretty sure that we can make a nice looking folder, but it really needs to be a folder. Now, as designers, we're not that excited about a folder either, because it's so boring, but we are human-centered above all. And so we have to put our own egos aside, and we have to be aware of the client's egos as well. And we have to say, really, what are users telling us? If the client ultimately decides to make a different decision and not listen to users, I think they're probably wasting their time and money with us when they probably should have designed it themselves. So yeah, I don't know if this feels similar to folks who work in kind of a corporate space or in government, but I think you're always resolving those needs. And if anything, I think it benefits clients to be told that up front, because they don't even realize it. They're like, I'm hearing from users because it's innovative. I'm hearing from users because it's the right thing to do, because it's cool. But actually, you're hearing from users because you are sharing in decision-making power. And decision-making power is ultimately the most important kind as it relates to this project and what we design. And so our job is to advocate on behalf of users, because they don't often have that voice, if not for us.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Richard, do you want to share the results from the poll?
Yeah, let me just ending the poll now. We got 95% people filling it out, which is great. I'm gonna share the results now. So we were just talking about this, right? So it seems like the area where like people are focused on this idea of conflicting priorities and how you kind of resolve those. Interestingly enough, people were less worried about regulation, and then I guess awareness was kind of the next thing. So I don't know if anyone has any kind of reflections on that, or whether that feels right.
This is so relevant in our world, Richard, because I think, I say this cautiously, I just don't know what I think about the world of user-centered design anymore. It kind of doesn't really work in the context that I work in, because it's, the types of decisions that are being made affect so many different groups. So I think, we've seen time and time again, you can design quite well for an individual, you can design quite well for a relatively small group of people, you can try to understand their experience quite well. But when you're like scaling up to the level of policy making, you suddenly have all of these different priorities, and you're like, okay, who comes up on top? And I was so glad, Sarah, that you mentioned power, because I just think that is absolutely the heart of any consideration of ethics. It's like, who has power and how are they using it? And our clients have power. The people that we are doing research with often don't, or have less power, but designers also have a lot of power. And I think there is this, I have this kind of concept in mind of the curating role of designers, and we get to choose, you know, who we listen to, the questions that we ask them, or the ways in which we spend time with them to understand their lives, and crucially how we curate those stories and how those are represented to people who really have power, like decision makers inside government. So actually, in many ways, designers are this kind of mediator between those conflicting priorities, and it's they who are often deciding you know, which voices get heard. And I think that's a very important thing to state, because a lot of responsibility comes with that. And I think it can be a bit opaque sometimes, particularly in the kind of research that we do, where we create a lot of film research, so it can feel quite unfiltered. It's not, it's highly curated. And I think it's really important for people on the receiving end of this kind of research to understand that.
I'm kind of really interested to kind of explore this idea of power a little bit more. I think it's a really interesting topic that we've kind of come across, and I think one kind of dimension of this, I mean, Margot was talking about kind of regulation, and there's a lot of power in a regulator. They have legal authority kind of behind them, and you know, design teams have these stories and anecdotes. Like how do those two things, you know, how do you as a designer or kind of researcher, you know, exert the power that you have against some of these what feel like very solid and immovable things that are happening in an industry?
Yeah, I think that, you know, rules are made to guide, regulations are made to guide, but we're in a phase where the FDA is creating, you know, new rules and policy every day in the US. And I think you know, the designer's role is to always, within the team and the organization that you're working in, challenge those rules and regulations, and not challenge them in a confrontational way, because they're there for good reason, but help the organization think about them differently and evolve them, you know, become champions for the reason why we're trying to affect a change or make a change. It's often the case where we first understand, okay, what is the rule that we have to follow here? And then it's, okay, well, why do we have to follow it? Okay, if that's the goal that we're trying to achieve, to avoid something or to avoid unintended consequences, that everyone can align on, but it's how do we do that in a new way? How do we challenge ourselves to think about this rule and really ask ourselves, what do we know about why this exists? And how are we going to follow this rule in a way that we haven't before? Because a lot of the things that we're doing in pharma, from a design point of view, we have never been done before. And so the rules are there to help guide us, but they're there to help us almost force the whole organization to be more creative. And a lot of the times, the people who are in the regulatory groups on the pharmaceutical side will say, okay, I need to talk to the FDA about this. And it's sort of building that conviction in them that they can then go and say, I'm going to the top we don't have a way, you know, to share these digital therapeutics, to talk about them. We have right now the first digital therapeutic that has 3 products in one. There isn't another one like that. So there is no rule. It's just an old rule and a regulation. And so I think it's really on the designers to just remind people, what are we trying to achieve? And rallying their internal groups to that common vision of, okay, if this is the rule today, how might we need to change it within our own organization, and then to the people who are making policy.
Yeah. Alberta, I know, like in your industry, you know, regulation's not not such a big factor right now, and you're kind of almost like able to sort of create some of the practices. What are some of the ways that you work with teams within Microsoft to help establish, practices, and how do you advocate for things as well within the organization?
Yeah, I think Sarah brought this up before, that ethics was different than morals, and I think one of the things that ethics, again, I used to be a writer, so epistemology is really important to me, like understanding the meaning of words, and I always, whenever I do presentations, I always level set with, this is what I mean by this. Like, I always explain my definition of design, and it's that definition I gave before about bringing meaningful order to chaos. And so ethics is a shared collective, right? Agreement, right? So there are shared rules, right? So as an organization, you decide that these are the collective kind of principles by what you are going to live, work by. And so one of the things that Microsoft does well, and that other teams that I really suggest, even before I got to Microsoft, is you have to have, well, we talked about this before, like for my students, I make them write their own ethical kind of principle. So starting from the individual, what is my ethical principle as a designer? Like, what's the line that I don't cross, right? And so that is very important, because you can't decide about power and whether you're giving it up or if you're going to do that or not, like in the moment. Sometimes, like in the product itself, you have to have this overall global view about how you're going to do design. And so we start with the individual, and then I encourage designers to write their own ethical statement, and then design ethics statement, and then in the organizations to challenge their teams and their organizations to say, what are your design values? What are your design ethical principles? And so when Margot's talking about rules and regulations, like one of the things we always talked about is IDEO, is that our ethical principles in AI go beyond, will we get sued, right? Like that's not an ethical principle. Like regulation is only as good as the people who abide by it, right? So if your thoughts about like the government is going to protect us, then maybe that's a little low bar for ethical principles, at least in my mind. So it's like, it starts with the individual, and then it goes to the organization and then the team that you're on. And so my team has charters. Our charter is, we use a human-centered approach. We have principles, design principles of how we engage with customers that are ethically, we've collectively said that this holds up to our larger Microsoft values of empowering everyone on the planet. Like that's Satya's like thing, like, and that's our thing as an organization. Like that's what we are supposed to be doing. And so that's a powerful statement, right? And so we have to break that down into our team and how our team executes our work. And so that's why our team has ethical principles. And I challenge every team at Microsoft that I come across in design to say, what are your design principles when it comes to ethics? And to be quite honest, like Camilla said, a lot of this is hard and new, right? That like evolving ethics into product making may seem like a given, right? But it's not. It's not. It has to be mindful. Like you have to engineer it. And so because of that, we have to redesign the way that we design products. And one of those things means that we have to have these design principles that are wholly focused on the impact of our designs. And so when we talk about power, I love that Sarah brought that up, because in AI, there is no such thing as informed consent. That's a fallacy. There are people at Google DeepMind who don't know how their algorithms work. So let's just throw this fallacy of informed consent out the window. most people have so low AI literacy. There's no way that they can explain how Alexa works, or even how their how they want it to work. So as far as power is, when it comes to AI, and again, I know I'm a one-note wonder here, the power is gone, right? It's in the hands of the creators, and we have to get it back. Like, that's what I see. Where as a designer, it's my job to balance it, right? To balance the power, because right now the power is all in the technocrats, and it's all in, read Tristan's book about how these powerful algorithms are taking away our attention span and our relationships and all this kind of stuff. And so for me, it's all about wresting back that power and balancing the power between humans and the machines that they interact with. And so the design principles that we work on talks about that balancing of power. I think it's naive of us to think that the user, that people who use these products could ever have the knowledge it takes for them to feel equal to the product maker. And I've had a lot of discussions about this, and that's another story, but it's really difficult for us to say, and we try with empathy and all kinds of other things to equalize it. But at the end of the day, we have to figure out how we can balance some of this power, but it's really difficult to do it, because once the product is made and once the people are using it, it's almost like, Congress never votes to lower their salaries, right? It's always upping the salary. Like, they don't, like, once you give a little power away, like, the powers that be don't just give it back. Oh, we'll just take it for 9/11 and then we'll give it back to you. Yeah, it never works that way. And so technology is the same way. Like, once that product is out there, it's really hard to kind of roll the power balance back, which is why as designers, we have to be in the room before the product exists. And we have to not only ask people what they want and desirability, but we have to bring an understanding of humanity into that room. That's really the power. It's not so much just the user and how the user will use the product, but it's more like understanding the cultural values and rituals of being a human and how that interacts with this product that's going to make a decision. That's really important for us. And I write about this extensively about, we are moving from a slave master narrative in tech. That is the narrative in tech. It is in the code, right? It's like they have a very like kind of idea of, it's slave master. That's ultimate power there. Like, I can't even tell you how that's not metaphorical. When you design, AI products, those are the words that are used, right? And so they have this, tech already has the power. So our job is to balance it out with bringing in what it means to be human and changing the paradigm of individual and machine and making it a human machine cooperative relationship. Like, that's how you gain power back, because now you're an equal party with the technology. And we think we're equal, but the way that products are designed, we're not, to be quite honest. And so my job at Microsoft is to beat that drum every time I'm in the room. And I had a student say, I was speaking about this, they say, how are you so optimistic? And I'm like, I'm optimistic because I'm in the room and I have this philosophy. That's what we need. We need more people, more designers who have this philosophy that there is an imbalance of power in product design. And we need to wrestle that back in favor of the human machine cooperative relationship. And I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying let's go back to the 1800s and forget and turn off AI. I'm only saying let's acknowledge we have been part of the problem. We have allowed technology and technocrats to lead us into this product power zeitgeist. And now we have the responsibility to pull it back, and we can. But we won't be able to do that much longer. I'm just being honest. Working at one of the most technically advanced companies, you know, when Satya and our leadership went to Congress and said we need facial recognition regulation, that should tell you how serious this technology is, because no company asks for like who does that, right? But because facial recognition, it's such a pervasive thing, Microsoft decided that we were not going to do it. Like, we were going to do aggregate, but not individual. So you can use our technology to do that. But that's the goodness of a corporation. Like, do we really want the goodness of corporations to be how we balance power in technology? I love Microsoft. I work here. I believe in their values. But one day we can get a new CEO and it could all change. Like another company, I won't say. So we need to really figure out as designers how we can instill these policies or these ethical principles in our design and product making that not ensure, but at least is mindful about balancing power between technology and humans.
Great. So unfortunately, we're almost near the end of our time. We have a couple of minutes left, but it was a great conversation. I'm just going to hand over to Leah to maybe do one kind of wrap up question, and then yeah.
Should we do a rapid fire? Maybe the one advice that each of you would give to someone who's like considering how to integrate ethics into their day-to-day practice. So we'll go around. I'll start with Camilla. I'm just going in order of how I'm seeing you guys.
I sneak in two. The first one is so obvious. It's so important. Don't forget that you are dealing with the material from real people's lives when you're sitting at your desk. And the second, I think, is very much responding to what Iveta just said, which is that we have to be prepared for our ethical frameworks and principles to change, because the things that we are designing are changing so quickly.
And I'll go to Sarah next.
I am always very inspired by Ibram X. Kendi, who says that every policy is either racist or anti-racist, that there is no not racist in our world. And so if you think about, and racism is one, probably the most prominent example of this, but when you think about the status quo being oppressive, the status quo is like a moving sidewalk. And so if you're standing still, you're actually on that moving sidewalk. And so basically you have to be walking backwards on the moving sidewalk. You have to be walking faster than the sidewalk is walking in this direction in order to actually change the status quo. So I think if we are not pushing against the status quo actively in our work as designers, if we just think I'm neutral, we're perpetuating it. So we have to be active in the ways that we push back against things that we feel are wrong.
Margot, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, I think one thing to think about is really when you are going into, a design research project, I really encourage people to think about the whole experience for the person that has, essentially volunteered to let you into their world and their mind. And to, we're going to go into it to learn something. We have objectives, we or have questions or ideas that we want to build. But I think to remember maybe what their perception might be, what they are going to get out of it, besides, maybe sharing their story or a little bit of money. What's the value that you're bringing to them? And that, I think, is maybe a very squishy kind of ethical thing, but I think it's really important to consider that you don't kind of get blindsided by your own objectives or your organization's own objectives, that you really try to balance that and create an equitable experience for the participant as well.
Anubeta. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm muted. So mine is pretty easy. Decide if you want the responsibility. Like, you have great power as a designer. So to me, that comes with a great responsibility. And I think we really, if you're gonna continue in this profession, I think it's really important that you have your own design ethics statement and values, and that you live by them. And I know it's easy for me to say, because people are like, oh, you have this great job or whatever, but I don't see how organizations and corporations are going to change if the people who work for them don't change them. So, Microsoft was like the Hunger Games 10 years ago. I mean, to be quite honest, it was a whole different space, and a lot of people and a lot of leadership things changed about that. And now it's changing into a different organization, and that's an example of how you, with ethical principles and living by those and designing by those, can change your organization through designing policies and procedures and processes that incorporate those ethical values you have as a designer. It's not just enough to sit on your hill and say, I am going to do good, but how do you empower and accelerate goodness with processes and product development? I'm really big on like incorporating this into pragmatic product development, because if it does, and I love IDEO, but if it doesn't get into the real world, it doesn't make sense, right? Like you're just kind of like, it's mutual making yourself feel good, which is why I'm at Microsoft now. So I have the ability to take those high-end ethical principles that I have in human-centered design and to incorporate them into a product development process. And not everybody has to do that, but I think if you do that, then that's how we see change in how these products are outputted into the world. So start with yourself, decide if you want the responsibility, create an ethical principle around that, and then try to codify that into processes and policies that you can use in design. It sounds simple, but it ain't.
Thank you so much. Speaking of design principles, one of our attendees did ask, and they said they loved your take on Ramsden principles, and we're asking if you had published it anywhere because they love to see it.
I totally just wrote this because, Sarah, this is so funny. Like right before I got here, I was reading George's article and I thought, these are great, but man, I just wanted to be a little bit more militant about it. And so I rewrote them. And so I will have them in some media article or Medium article soon. So I'll share it with you guys.
Yeah, and I guess I just feel the need to mention on George's behalf, my co-founder George, that he was naming Dieter Rams to say these are old and outdated.
Yeah,
and we
that's
need
what
to
I meant.
Them.
Yeah. He rewrote them too.
Yeah, we rewrote them together. So it's good design honors reality, good design creates ownership, and good design shifts power. And that those could be the standards by which we judge design in our corner of the world, at least. But yeah, he actually had the opportunity to work with the, Camilla's going to know what they're called. What are they called? The National,
Royal College of Art? Or Royal College or something.
Yeah, the RCA. Yeah.
Okay,
I thought it was the Royal College of Arts, but
I think that's it. But to basically redesign their national design competition for students.
Yeah, which was awesome.
Yeah. I think we are hungry for principles and guiding tenets that can guide our work as designers.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. This was such an engaging conversation. I know that I really enjoyed it, and based on the comments that I saw in the chat, I feel like our attendees also enjoyed it a lot. So thank you so much to all of you. Just a note that we'll be doing a recap of the session, and we'll be sharing it in the coming days. But also in January 26th, we'll be doing another salon, and it's called People from the Future. That's how do we integrate human-centered design with forecasting and speculative design. So thank you so much to everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.